Well, it's been a little while since we did a performance test for a game. Let's see how it goes for Kingdom. Come Deliverance 2 or KCD2. For those in the know, we'll see how it performs right after a quick sponsor break. So there's a small change that isn't really a change for the channel's sponsor. You probably know GSKILL, which has been supporting the channel for almost 2 years now, and well. Now we're shifting to KissFan, which is another site from the same company, but it's exactly the same thing. So we have the classics along with the same promo codes and discounts with Windows 10 Pro keys for under $9. And Windows 11 Pro keys for under $14 with the channel code VCG50. And for Office keys or the Windows Plus Office packs, you get a 62% discount with the code VCG62. At the payment level, the process is explained at the bottom of the offer page, which will allow you to choose your payment method by card or PayPal, and when you receive the keys up there by email with the instructions for using them, don't forget to check that the email is not in your spam directory just in case. If you encounter any problems, do not hesitate to contact customer service, which is available 7 days a week and 24 hours a day, and will assist you as soon as possible. All the links are in the description of the video, and as usual, thank you if you buy a key, because it allows you to support the channel, which survives largely thanks to this partnership, while having something in return. So a big thank you to you for your support, and to KissFan, who sponsors this video. So Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is the sequel to Kingdom Come Deliverance. We're looking at a medieval RPG that aims to be relatively realistic. Well, realistic if you want, but there's no magic or that kind of stuff here. The game is developed by Warhorse Studio, it runs on CryEngine, and that's nice. It's a bit of a change from the flood of titles out there. Unreal Engine 5, even though it comes with its share of positive and negative points, on the positive side, there's no stuttering, no shader compilation when launching the game, and that's really nice for an open world game, since it's quite rare for that to happen. The game isn't too resource hungry either, and you can get by with a pretty modest setup, as we'll see later. As for the vegetation and the environments, and all of that is quite nice without being a technical marvel. It's true that sometimes, in terms of LOD, there are a few hiccups, but overall it's still pretty decent. The ADA aims to be realistic, so it's not flashy or fantastical like in other games. But it's true that the overall look can feel a bit old school. Can do a little bit old school. It's true that if we put the game up against The Witcher 3, we could often say that the games are from roughly the same era. The big weak point, I would say, for me, is in terms of the characters and the animations. It does feel quite outdated at that level. And apparently it seems that the people living in this world all have a bit of a stick up their butt. So, personally, it doesn't bother me that much. Not that they have a stick up their butt, but it does feel a bit outdated. I prefer a game, I would say, that is consistent with its technical ambitions and its budget. And here, it seems to me, it's pretty well optimized, pretty well polished. The game looks pretty clean overall. The feedback seems pretty positive overall as well, even from a technical standpoint. So we'll see if it's the same at the end of the game compared to the beginning. Well, I don't know anything about that, unfortunately. So, no, it's not a technical marvel. But I would say that the interest of the title lies more about its immersion, its roleplay aspect, but also its atmosphere. And that's the main thing. We don't necessarily need to be at the cutting edge of technology, I would say, to offer a pleasant adventure to play that remains still pleasant to the eye and sufficiently immersive too. I think that's definitely the case here. For the PC version, we have support for ultra-wide. In terms of upscaling, we have DLSS and FSR. On the other hand, no XISS, which is always a bit of a shame. It's interesting to note that in terms of anti-aliasing, T-Straps doesn't offer a basic option, but rather SMAA1X, 1TX, or AL2TX. No ray tracing, no frame generation. The menus are very basic, without any frills, nothing shocking or particular. It might be a bit lacking in polish, but it's functional in terms of the graphic presets. So we have the low, medium, high, ultra, and experimental modes, which is the highest level for scaling performance presets. As we can see here for the performance, it scales quite well and in a rather linear way, which is a good thing. And between the low preset and the experimental preset in native 4K, here we go from 98 to 221 FPS. And in terms of image rendering, it mainly affects the quality of the textures, the draw distance, and the shadow rendering. If your gear can handle ultra or experimental mode, why not? I would say that the ultra mode is already pretty good. But hey, if you're having a bit more trouble, I would say that the high mode will definitely do the job as well. And in terms of scaling, of upscaling, it's rather average, since between native and quality mode we only gain 30% performance. So, newer engines, which are designed with upscaling in mind, have greater gains at this level than what we see here. But hey, when you take that into account, there's nothing really shocking about the fact that we're only at 30% here. I'm not going to do, I would say, an analysis, very long or very advanced upscalers this time due to lack of time. But from what I've been able to observe quickly, we're dealing with the usual stuff. Note that the FSR produces more 6 lines on moving vegetation than the DSS, which is still one of the biggest weaknesses of the FSR that will hopefully be corrected with the FSR 4. There is a bit of ghosting with the 2 upscalers at the building level from time to time at a distance. The native rendering is not perfect on all points either, especially in terms of the treatment of distant vegetation, so well, it's up to you to see and test to see a little bit the rendering that you will prefer. If necessary, I would say that the title lends itself quite well to upscaling. It is not a title where there are masses of particles transparency which would suddenly put the FSR in more difficulty, so well whether it is DLSS or FSR, both will be able to do the job depending on whether you need it or not. For the comparison, I've had time to do some quick captures so we can do our usual face-offs before the summary graphs. As for the drivers, these are the latest ones for all 3 brands, including the latest beta driver for AMD. And compared to the latest game tests of the genre, we obviously have the arrival of the RTX 5000 series with the 5090 and the 5080, and it's the 5090 that will be used now for the processor tests, of course. The test sequence is set in one of the first small villages of the game. We have a 30-second sequence that will be used for the processor and graphics card tests here. Anyway, let's see how it performs. So just like before, we started with the 4090 on its own, since it didn't really have any competitors. Well, now it's the 5090 that takes over in 4K. Native, in detail, it was running around 140, 150 FPS here, no particular issues, none. The most demanding game in the world, no ray tracing or anything like that, so it's running pretty well, around 150 FPS, no issues at all. And then we have the 5080 and the 4090, and as we can see here, well, one of them is around 90 FPS on average, the other a bit closer to 100, 110. There's a slight gap between the two, but it's not a game where I'd say the RTX 5000s perform poorly, so it's pretty standard scaling, let's say here. Well, we're around 100 FPS. For both, it's going pretty well. Next, we have the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX. And as we can see here, it's slightly in favor of the 4080 Super, which is the case in quite a few games that have come out recently. There's often a slight advantage for the 4080 Super, and so the 7900 XTX, as we also saw in my tests of the RTX 5000, tends to lose ground. We had a certain lead in rasterization, that is less so now. Is it a matter of driver optimization? The cuts we're seeing are due to the capture card, I can't do anything about it. But anyway, both cards are around 80 FPS on average, so it's going pretty well after all. Next up, we have the 4070 XT Super and the 7900 XT in native 4K here, and we can see that we're getting much closer to an average of 60 FPS. But once again, despite everything, there's a slight advantage. Let's say for the GeForce, since the 4107 is great, it's true that we were often used to seeing it a notch below the 7900 XT. Well, it's the same here. As we've seen, lately AMD's drivers might be a bit less optimized, which allows the 4107 is great at catching up or simply positioning itself better, and we can see that in 1440p. Pretty much the same with the same cards. The 4107 is great with slightly higher performance. We're still well above 100 FPS for both cards, so there's no particular issue. In 1440p, here, it's going to run quite well. And we're going down a shaft with the 4070 Super and the 7900 GRE. And we don't necessarily see that advantage for the Nvidia cards here, since the 410 Super is roughly about 10% ahead most of the time in this game. Well, those are still quite acceptable performances. Still, we're around 100 FPS at native 1440p for these cards. That's more or less what we expect. And then we have the 4070 and the 7800 XT still at 1440p. At native, while both cards are doing very well, we're getting around 90-100 FPS. There's no special issue. A slight advantage once again for the 4070 here, even though it's true that usually we tend to see the 7800 XT a notch above. Well, in this game, it's clearly an advantage for the GeForce overall. Now we're moving on to the slightly more budget-friendly cards, 1080p, the 4060 Ti and the 7700 XT. Well, it's not a very demanding game. From a VRAM perspective, the 4060 Ti, whether it's the 8 or 16GB model, will perform very well, even in 4K. Apparently, there's no issue with the VRAM. It's undemanding for this title. And we can see that here in 1080p, performance is around 100, 115 FPS. It's really running very, very well for both cards. And for the dual of the smaller cards from the previous generation, we have the 4060 and the RX 7600. And as we can see, the 4060 has a slight advantage, just like it did for almost all the cards in this segment. It's still running very, very well here. We're averaging around 80 FPS for both cards, and there are no major issues. This means that at 1440p, upscaled, these two cards would be roughly at the same level of performance in terms of detail, quality, and that would be very, very acceptable as well. Next, we move on to the previous generation cards, the 3090 Ti and the 3080. Unsurprisingly, the 3090 Ti is more efficient. We are here in native 1440p. We are around 9100 FPS for the 3080. The 3090 Ti runs more around 110, 120. It's definitely playable for both cards, no matter what. Next, we move on to the 2080 Ti and the 6700 XT. Well, here we can see that the 6700 XT has a slight advantage. Which one performs a bit better overall? But the 2080 Ti still performs quite well for its age. Pretty decent performance. We're getting around 70, 80, 85 FPS for the 6700 XT. Overall, good performance for native 1080p. Here, it's playable for both cards. It would definitely be playable under the same conditions, for upscaled 1440p. And for the RTX 3060 and the RX 6600, here, the RTX 3060 clearly has the advantage, offering better performance than the 6600 as we're getting around 70, 75 FPS, while the 6600 struggles a bit more to reach an average of 60 FPS. Well, it's still playable. Still, you'll just need to lower it a bit more. The details... Now we move on to even older cards, the 1080 Ti and the RTX 2060. As we can see, the 2060 holds its ground. I'd say it's just barely hitting the average of 60 FPS. It's a bit similar to the RX 6600. We can see that in terms of VRAM, it's not too much of a problem. We're a bit tight though. I think there might be the occasional stutter here and there with the 2060. We can lower the textures a notch. I'd say it would work a bit better, the 1080 Ti. However, no problem here. We're getting around 70-80 FPS on average, which is pretty good performance. As for the cards, Intel then for the B580. I had a little issue with the 1%. As we can see here, the performance wasn't very stable. I saw other tests where they were testing the card, and apparently they didn't have the problem, so I don't know if it's something on my end or if there was another issue in the game right there. Well, the fact is that at my place, the B580 had less stable performance than the 770. Is it a general rule? I don't know, but at least for me, that's how it was. And finally, a quick look at the GTX 1060, and while we can see that it's not doing too badly here. For high detail, we see that it's running around 30-40 FPS, let's say, at that detail level. On medium, it's more around 40, a bit more stable. So if we lowered it a notch again, I think we wouldn't be too far off. An average of 60 FPS on that card is definitely playable. Here, we can manage... And I even did a little test on medium detail with FSR in quality mode, and we can see that we're getting a bit closer to 60 FPS, so does that provide a better experience than lowering the size down? Well, I'd say that's up to you to decide, but we can see that it's possible to use the card to play this game under pretty decent conditions. So we can still manage with the little 1060 here on this game. And if we now look at how it happens in table form, well, we find more or less what we had observed in video, even in 1080p. Namely that the GeForce overall have an advantage over the Radeon, since we see, for example, that the 4080 is super here and still a good step above the 7900 XDX, at least in terms of average performance, but when it comes to the 1%, we can see that it's not that far off. But it's true that at 1080p, there are moments where we might be a little bit more bottlenecked by the processor. Overall, what we notice is that there's a slight advantage for Nvidia cards. On this title, AMD cards perform quite well overall. There are no particular issues. And we can see that we can manage in very good conditions, even with rather modest cards, since we see that the 4060, we're averaging around 80-90 FPS, the 7600 as well. We see the little 1% issue for the Intel card, particularly for the B580, which means that in my tests, it had more stable and pleasant performance with the 770 than with the B580. And at the bottom of the table, we note that the GTX 1060 averages around 30 FPS, just as we saw in the video. We arrive at 1440p, and we can clearly see that the 5090 is riding solo. After that, we're above 200 FPS on average, 60 FPS more. It may seem impressive, but hey, we're sticking to about 30% more performance from the card. Then we find the 5080 more or less between the 4080 Super and the 4090. It's more or less where we expect it. And we also find the advantage to Nvidia cards overall, since here the 4080 Super takes a little more the ascendancy compared to 1080p on the XTX. Still, overall here we see that the majority of the cards are still doing very well. Since we are still around 60 FPS on average without upscaling, even for the 6700 XT, 4060 or RX 7600, we could, I would say, lower the details by a notch to get there. We can still use upscaling and all that. It will run very correctly. On the vast majority of the cards even, the RX 7600 here is averaging around 40 FPS. At 3440 by 1440, we're increasing it a bit more. The load, well, it's pretty linear. So, we definitely find the 5090 all alone above 200 FPS on average, the 4090 is more around 160, and the 5080 is averaging 140 FPS. It's pretty much right in between the 4080 Super and the 4090, and we find ourselves a little behind the 7900 XTX, the 3090 Ti, the 4070 Ti Super, and the 7900 XT will pretty much offer the same gaming experience. We can see that the 3080, 4110 and 7800 XT are all quite capable of delivering over 60 FPS on average. Here, it's quite suitable for playing in good conditions, and there's no need for upscaling. In 4K, on the other hand, well, it becomes a little more complicated despite everything. The 5090, as we saw in the video, maintains around 150 FPS, on average with 146. Here, the 4090 is closer to 100, 110, while the 5080 is just below 100 FPS on average. The 4080 Super and 7900 XTX are more around 80, a slight advantage for the 4080 Super in 4K. The 7900 XTX has more or less caught up in terms of performance at lower resolutions. We can see that everything below the RX 7900 XT doesn't reach an average of 60 FPS, but we're not too far off for the 4070 Super and 7900 GRE. And even for the 3080, 7800 XT and 4070 with a little bit of upscaling, we should be able to manage it without too many problems. And that should be more than playable. Next, we move on to the processors, and we can see that the 9800X3D takes the top spot. No big surprise there. The 7800X3D is a notch behind, but there's nothing wrong, let's say. It's still in second place, quite comfortably, since it's a good step up above the 14700K, which is in third place and also offers quite decent gaming conditions, and the Core Ultra 7 265K isn't too far behind. But we can see that the 9600X isn't doing too well either, even though at the 1% level the 265K performs better. The gap between the 9600X and the 7600 isn't really that high. Overall, we're about 5% behind. It's more or less what we expected. The R13600K still delivers very, very solid performance, and we can see that the 5800X 3D is also doing quite well in a completely respectable manner. And as usual, we see a slight drop in performance with the Ryzen 5 1600 and the i3 13100F and the Ryzen 3600. So the Ryzen 5600, well, it's still quite playable. We can see that it could easily run around 100 to 130 FPS without too many issues. The i3 13100, however, it gets a bit more complicated since we see that on average it's not bad, but at the 1% level it struggles a bit more, probably due to its 4 cores. So, well, we see that over time, the quad-core, it becomes a little more complicated than before. Since we can see that the Ryzen 3600, even though it has slightly lower average performance, is a bit more stable. And so, there you go, I think we've covered quite a bit for this Kingdom as Deliverance 2. Personally, it was really nice to test a game on the CryEngine, since that unfortunately happens too rarely. But here it was running quite well. The game doesn't seem too buggy, and the optimization seems decent. It's not the lightest game, I would say, but we can manage with pretty modest hardware. We saw that we could play without too many issues with a GTX 1060 and a Ryzen 3600. The older quad-core processors, it might be a little less stable. Let's say, it should be playable as well. But it's true that it's not a sausage fest when it comes to stutters, and that always feels good. So of course, as always, you have to like the game's style and its gameplay. But technically speaking, there's not much to criticize. And I think it's a game that will appear in GPU test panels simply because it's a different engine, and it's good to have a pretty wide range of engines. So, as a tester, I'm pretty happy at this level. So anyway, as usual, if you enjoyed the video, the annoying YouTube stuff, I know it's silly, but it really helps. The Amazon page for the channel with examples of typical setups, the current graphics cards, is in the video description, and that helps a lot. A big thank you to the Ko-fi and YouTube support members of the channel for helping it survive. A big thank you to you. And otherwise, we'll see each other very soon for the next video. Sending you kisses. See you next time.